Okay, so you guys really sent in some interesting stuff this time around. It looks like we've got a whole bunch of articles and research and stuff all about why kids just seem to completely lose it when it comes to transitions, like leaving the playground or, just switching between tasks. So get ready, because today we're going deep and really figuring out what's going on in those little brains. We're going to go way past just, they're being difficult.
Yeah, and what's really wild is that, even though tantrums and all that resistance, even though it all might look the same from the outside, the reasons behind it can be totally different.
That's so true. And this article we got, Why Kids Struggle with Transitions, it's from the Child Mind Institute, and it gets into all those little details. So what are we doing today? Well, we're going to give you a much better understanding of all of this, because let's be real, we've all been there, right? I mean, parents, teachers, or just anyone who hangs out with kids, those transition meltdowns are really a thing.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing is, you got to remember that transitions are tough for everyone. Even for us, just think about how much energy it takes to just kind of shift your brain into a new gear and get used to something new. Now imagine not having a fully developed brain or, those emotional skills to really handle those changes smoothly. That's like the daily life for a kid.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And this is where things get really interesting. This article digs into ADHD, autism, sensory processing stuff, and anxiety. Let's start with ADHD. I think most people think it's just about kids not being able to focus.
Yeah.
But this article says it's way more complicated.
Oh yeah, it's definitely not that simple.
Yeah.
The newest research is kind of moving away from thinking of ADHD as just not being able to pay attention and looking at it more like a problem with controlling attention. And what's really interesting? It all ties into how the brain's reward system works.
Reward system. Whoa, okay, tell me more about that.
Well, there are studies that show that for kids with ADHD, transitions aren't just about focusing. It's about motivation too. Their brains, they might not get the same sense of reward from everyday stuff that other brains do. So picture this. You're trying to get a kid to stop playing video games, which are super stimulating and rewarding, to do something like homework, which might not be nearly as exciting for their brains.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that. That honestly changes how I think about all those homework battles. So it's not even just about getting them to focus. It's more like realizing that their brains are kind of wired to find different things rewarding.
Exactly. And that's where all those meltdowns that seem to come out of nowhere come from. Imagine feeling this huge drop in reward, almost like someone just cut off your fun. That can be so frustrating, especially for kids who maybe haven't developed those emotional control centers as much.
So you're saying those big emotional outbursts, they aren't always on purpose or a way to manipulate?
Not really, no. They could actually be having a really hard time managing those big feelings. It's like their emotions are stuck on high volume.
Okay, so we've got ADHD in the reward system. Now let's switch gears to autism. I know routine is super important for kids with autism, but how does that connect to all these transition problems?
Well, for kids on the autism spectrum, the world can feel really confusing and overwhelming. Having a routine and being able to predict what's going to happen, those become super important coping mechanisms. Imagine a life raft in a crazy storm.
This article uses the term cognitive inflexibility to talk about this. What does that actually mean?
So cognitive inflexibility means that some kids with autism have a tough time changing their thought patterns and getting used to changes. Imagine a kid who always eats their sandwich in a very specific order. For us, changing that order might seem like no big deal, but for them, it could feel like their whole world is upside down. That's cognitive inflexibility in action.
So while a kid without autism might think leaving the playground is just a little annoying, a kid with autism might see it as a really upsetting change to their routine.
That's exactly right. And because they really need things to be predictable, any change, even something that seems small, can make them anxious and upset.
That makes so much sense. It's not about being stubborn. It's about their brains being wired to need order and predictability, especially in a world that can feel really chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to get why those struggles are happening. It's not about calling kids difficult, but about recognizing that their brains work differently, and those differences affect how they experience the world, especially transitions.
Okay, so we've talked about how ADHD can make it hard to switch gears and how autism makes routine really important. What about sensory processing problems? I know we hear a lot about that with kids too. How does that connect to transitions?
That's a great question. Sensory processing issues, they can happen in any kid, whether they have ADHD or autism or not. For these kids, the world can feel like it's just too much, too fast, too loud, too bright. Everything.
It's like their senses are going crazy all the time.
Exactly. And so they need order and control to deal with all that sensory overload. And transitions, which mess up that sense of order, can be really hard for them. Imagine being surrounded by flashing lights and loud noises all the time. That's how it feels for some kids. Now imagine trying to leave that and go into a quiet car. That sudden change can be completely overwhelming.
So it's like their systems are constantly on high alert, trying to handle all the sensory input, and then bam, a transition happens and throws everything off balance.
Exactly. It's no wonder that transitions can make these kids resist, avoid things, or even have huge meltdowns. They aren't trying to be difficult, they're just trying to cope.
Okay, so we've covered ADHD, autism, and sensory processing. That's already given me so much to think about. But there's one more piece I want to look at. Anxiety. How does anxiety play into all this transition stuff?
This one's super important because anxiety can show up in so many ways, and sometimes it's really hard to see. It could be fear of what's going to happen, being afraid of being separated, or even anxieties that come from bad experiences in the past.
So it's not always the transition itself that's the problem. It's what that transition means or where it leads.
That's it. Imagine a kid who had a scary experience with a dog. Just leaving the house could cause a meltdown because they're worried about seeing another dog. It's not leaving the house itself, it's the anxiety that comes with it.
That's such a good point. It reminds me how important it is to really understand each kid and what specifically triggers them. Something that seems like a simple transition to us could be full of anxiety for them.
And that's exactly why understanding the real reason behind a kid's transition struggles is so important. It's not about saying they're difficult or anxious or whatever. It's more about getting that their experience of the world might be totally different from ours.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to just focus on how they're acting and forget that there's like a whole world going on inside that we might not even see.
Right, exactly. And, once we understand that, that's when we can start finding ways to actually help kids get through these tough moments.
Yeah.
So let's kind of switch gears here. Let's talk about what we can actually do to help kids handle transitions better.
Yes. Okay, I'm ready. We've talked about the problem, so now let's talk about solutions. What are some things that parents, teachers, or just anyone who works with kids, what can they actually do?
Well, the big thing to remember is that there's no magic solution that works for every kid. The best strategies depend on each kid and what they're dealing with. But there are some general ideas that can be super helpful for pretty much everyone. And the first one is all about preparing.
Preparation, okay. I can see how that would be important, especially for kids who really need routine and like to know what's going to happen.
You got it. Kids do better when they can predict what's going to happen. So whenever we can, we should give them a heads up about what's coming. Instead of just suddenly saying, okay, time to go, we give them a little warning. Like, hey, in 5 minutes, we're going to head over to grandma's house.
That makes a lot of sense. It gives them time to get ready in their minds. And for kids who learn best by seeing things, maybe we can even use a timer or something, something real they can see to help them understand that time is passing.
Absolutely. Using visual stuff can be super helpful. You can even make a schedule with pictures that show what's going to happen in order. This is especially good for kids with autism who depend on routine and visual cues. It makes time something they can see and understand instead of this abstract thing.
I love that idea. It's like giving them a map for the day. It takes away the surprise, which can be really unsettling for some kids. What else can we do to prepare kids for transitions?
Another good strategy is to let them be part of the process as much as possible. Instead of just telling them what to do, give them choices whenever you can, like, do you want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt today? Or do you want to walk to the car or ride in the stroller?
Giving them even a little bit of control can make a big difference, huh? It helps them feel like they're not just being pushed around all day.
That's right. It makes them feel more powerful and less overwhelmed by everything that's happening around them. And speaking of feeling overwhelmed, remember that transitions can bring up a lot of big feelings. It's really important to recognize those feelings instead of just brushing them off.
So instead of saying something like, don't cry, it's not a big deal, we could try saying something like, I know it's hard to leave the playground. You were having so much fun.
Exactly. Showing empathy is key. We got to let them know that we get why they're upset, This doesn't mean we have to give in to whatever they want, but it does mean letting them know that their feelings matter. And once they feel like we hear them and understand, they might be more ready to move on to the next thing.
It's like we're saying, I see you, I hear you, and what you're feeling is important. That can be so powerful for a kid who's feeling overwhelmed and like nobody gets them.
For sure. And sometimes just distracting them a little can really help. Try redirecting their attention to something fun and positive, like, I know you're sad to leave the park, but guess what? We're going to make cookies when we get home.
It's like a gentle way to lead them into the next activity instead of just making them stop what they're doing.
You got it. And finally, the key here is to be consistent. Have clear routines and stick to them as much as you can. This helps kids know what to expect and makes them less anxious about transitions.
So things like bedtime is always at 8, dinner's at 6, and we always brush our teeth after breakfast. Having these predictable routines makes them feel safe and stable.
Exactly. And it makes all those transitions from playtime to bedtime, from school to home, so much less stressful for everyone. It's like having a familiar beat to the day.
You know, that reminds me of this one time. This has honestly been a total eye-opener for me. We started off thinking about transitions as just these little annoying things in the day, but now I really get how hard they can be for kids, especially those with ADHD, autism, sensory stuff or anxiety. And you've given us so many good ideas to try, like prepping ahead of time, giving choices, acknowledging their feelings, and setting routines.
Yeah, and it's not about making transitions totally disappear. It's more about giving kids the tools and the support they need to get through those changes, a little easier.
I totally agree. And what I really love about these deep dives is that we get so much more than just information. We're getting a whole new way of seeing the world, and especially the world of kids.
And what's really cool for me is that with this knowledge, we can move from just reacting to behaviors to actually helping kids in a way that makes sense and shows we care.
Okay, so before we wrap things up, let's think about you, the listener. Think about a specific transition that's really tough for a child in your life. What really stood out to you from this deep dive?
Maybe it's realizing that a kid with ADHD might actually be struggling with being motivated, not just with focusing. Or maybe it's understanding that a meltdown during a transition that seems simple could actually be because of some serious anxiety.
We've given you a ton to think about today, but this is really just the start. What ideas are you excited to try out? What questions are you still wondering about? Hold on to those questions as you keep learning and growing and understanding more about kids.
And hey, remember, next time you see a kid struggling with a transition, try to come at it with some empathy and understanding. Take a second to think about all the different reasons we've talked about today. What might be happening underneath that behavior that seems so difficult?
This deep dive has honestly changed the game for me. I feel like I've got a whole new set of tools, and I understand so much more about what's really going on when kids freak out about transitions.
I've loved diving into all of this with you. And until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open to the amazing world of kids.